Good morning and welcome. My name is Michael Kelker. I teach English in the St. Charles Community College English Department, and I have been the organizer of Democracy Days 2001 to present. We have a very special presentation right now featuring Chaz DeBord of Philosophy. We will have his presentation, and I'll be collecting comments and questions in the chat box right beneath the video. So if you click that link and you can open that chat box, you can offer comments and questions, and I will convey those at the end of our presentation for that discussion portion of the program. Please be aware that we have 10 more presentations for Democracy Days this week, including 1 o'clock today with the Director of Elections of St. Charles County. All right, now, Chaz DeBord.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you to Nick Wallace and everybody who's been responsible for the production of yet another excellent Democracy Days here at SCC. And thank you for everybody who's joining us. This is a paper that grew in the telling since the months in which I've written the abstract some time ago. I'm sure many of us have had an experience with that sort of thing. So if you'll indulge me, I'll go ahead and read the paper, and then I'll be happy to be part of any conversation that people would like to have afterwards. No holding back. Mark McCluskey was running out of time. A mob of protesters was descending on his neighborhood. What happened to the McCluskeys could just as easily have happened to you. The out-of-control mob was enraged and seeking to kill McCluskey, his wife, and their little dog, too. The McCluskeys knew that in today's topsy-turvy America, the government would protect criminals from honest citizens. These people wanted to spread violence and chaos, to abolish the suburbs, and to be in charge of the future of your children. At this moment in history, he tells us, he could not back down. Mark McCluskey grabbed his rifle and started to scream. The protesters were running out of time, too. In the wake of the protests following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, some in the St. Louis area had called on the city to defund the police. St. Louis Mayor Lyda Krewson subsequently doxed these activists, broadcasting their names and addresses. She had resorted to intimidation in an effort to chill debate and silence dissent. She had put a hit out on her constituents. On this day late in June, protesters marched to the mayor's house. She has subsequently relocated, citing disruption to her neighbors. Time was up for the mayor. Time was up for the police. Resign. Defund. America, argues author Richard Kreitner, is running out of time. We sound, he says, as if we do not really want to continue to be members of one country. Portland Place isn't the only street around here on which the clock is ticking. Earlier in June, 4 St. Louis police officers were shot downtown while patrolling a protest. Chief John Hayden called the shooter a coward and the situation mayhem. Downtown resident Dustin Johnson retorted that we tried to be peaceful already and that didn't work. Later that same month, 77-year-old David Dorn, a retired police captain, was shot dead while defending a friend's place of business. No takers yet, it seems, for the job of attempting to publicly justify the actions of shooter Stefan Cannon. By contrast, there's been no shortage of public support for Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old out-of-towner who stormed into Kenosha, Wisconsin late in August to provide protection no one had requested, certainly not the 2 people he killed that night. Still, he must have seemed a sympathetic figure to some as he ran through the dark streets. Police opted not to stop him, instead offering him water and thanking him for the job he was doing. To date, online fundraisers for his legal defense have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. An enthusiast for law enforcement, Rittenhouse has perhaps been emboldened by the number of federal troops dispatched this summer to cities across America, often having received no more of an invitation than had Rittenhouse himself. Or maybe he remembered the police officers in Buffalo, whose violence led to the hospitalization of an elderly man who had had the temerity to speak to him. Signs of violent fragmentation can be found elsewhere than in crowded streets. Sometimes all it takes is a hankering for ribs. 18-year-old Arlo Kinsey was ready to start his shift at a barbecue joint just outside Kansas City When a barefaced customer walked in, Kinsey asked him to put on a mask in order to comply with the statewide mandate. The customer refused, then lifted his shirt, revealing a handgun holstered at his hip. These episodes involve unmistakable motifs of the decline of national unity. In lieu of a staid dedication to justice, we have in the McCloskey incident opposing acts of domineering self-assertion. Shooting deaths in the streets of Kenosha and St. Louis, underscored as they tend to be with white-hot moral confidence, offer self-certainty in place of devotion to the truth. The would-be gunfight at RJ's Bob BQ is one instance among uncountably many of nationwide mask and counter-mask headbutting in the midst of the coronavirus, in which the love of life is joylessly parodied in self-isolation. It is no hyperbole to point out that the obvious fracturing to which these signs bear witness has sparked nothing short of a national panic. Evidence for this can be found in various hollow attempts to gin up public unity, though mostly its purveyors seem willing to settle for nothing more than fleeting appearances. For a brief few weeks this past spring, we were asked to entertain the oddly heartwarming story of a nation rallying behind the steady hand of Anthony Fauci, epidemiologist extraordinaire. That is, until another high-ranking official in the same administration began to openly question and deride the good doctor. In Fauci versus Navarro, the real loser was the patina of togetherness through expertise. Though truth be told, there was little hope for the technocrats. They've been steadily losing ground for the past half-decade. This failure of harmony by fiat cleared the way for the advent of our very own cultus imperatorius. On the 1st of June, President Donald Trump held a press conference outside the White House at which he directed local government and law enforcement agencies across the country to dominate the streets in response to the George Floyd protests, indicating his readiness to deploy the United States military if he deemed it necessary. Then, upon the conclusion of his remarks, the president went to church. Military police showered Lafayette Square in tear gas, clearing away citizens with truncheons and flash grenades, so that the man sworn to protect the Constitution could seize a photo op that implied his job description had expanded to include the protection of Christ and the Bible. This charade of effecting national unity through hollow majesty cannot even be said to have fallen flat, since that would imply that it had ever left the ground. Our national crisis does not readily lend itself to scientific explanation. This is primarily because the choice of a proper explanatory method is unclear. Empirical descriptions may well be misleading, inasmuch as it remains obscure just what ought to be quantified and measured. Functional analysis suffers from an embarrassment of etiological riches. Mountains of variables leave even basic premises of causal influence open to question. Game theoretic and algorithmic accounts founder in the absence of sound criteria for modeling. Just how should one schematize a Turing machine for the QAnon movement? Where even to begin? For my part, I have no novel methodology to propose. Instead, I'm going to stick to the script, gratefully taking this opportunity at Democracy Days, as I have in years past, to advertise for philosophy. Philosophy is not in the business of solving social problems. Philosophy deals in concepts. I am well aware that this smacks of a retreat. It is my humble hope in the remainder of my remarks here today that I will help to dispel this false impression. Nevertheless, it must be conceded that philosophy offers us no shortcuts to the truth, nor does philosophy furnish us with new empirical facts or enable clairvoyance through the transmission of esoteric knowledge. That said, philosophy does promise a kind of second sight, not so much in the manner of crystal gazing, more along the lines of what happens when one puts on much needed corrective lenses. The primary engine of philosophy is the puzzle. Puzzles themselves are features of what we might call conscious experience. A puzzle is properly framed as a question. More specifically, a philosophical puzzle is an exclusively disjunctive question, an either-or whose alternatives contradict one another. Exactly one of the two alternatives must be true and the other false. The question, do green plants require light in order to grow, is an example of an exclusively disjunctive question. The answer is either yes or no. It has to be one. It can't be both. But this question is not a philosophical puzzle. The reason for this has nothing to do with the fact that philosophers are not generally trained in the botanical sciences. The question of whether or not green plants require light to grow is non-philosophical because the answer is unproblematic. No quandary arises from saying yes. Indeed, we may ask for evidence of this answer or inquire how light makes plants grow, but the answer to whether they require it does not conflict with other features of our conscious experience. By contrast, consider the question, is time an aspect of the physical universe or a construct of the mind? Notice that either answer one gives conflicts with general and obvious features of experience. Relatedly and crucially, the further we press our attempt to determine an answer, the more uncertain we become of the premises that led us to the puzzle in the first place. Much more could be said about the nature of philosophical puzzles, but I'm here today to exemplify philosophy by focusing on one puzzle that presses in on us ever more by the day. The puzzle can be stated quite succinctly. Is the Republic one? Allow me first to clarify my terms. I mean republic in its original sense, the people's thing, whatever further analysis proves that to be. I choose the word republic in an effort to insulate against noise. Every conspicuous alternative, state, nation, civil society, comes loaded with its own special baggage. The notion of a republic is itself not entirely unproblematic, but in the case of this puzzle, the term allows us to work at a suitably general level, and it suggests something important about the nature of what it is we're dealing with. By the term one, I mean whatever is signified by the declaration that appears on the Great Seal of the United States, a pluribus unum, of many, one. It is principally important here to distinguish significance from intention. I'm talking about a concept, not anybody's conception of it. That this disjunction is demonstrably real, I take for granted. For the sake of our precious time, I am not going to entertain objections from the corridors of nominalism. It is a truth long established in modern times, from Peirce to Frege to Wittgenstein, that significance is neither a property nor a product of individual supposition. As Hilary Putnam once put it, meanings just ain't in the head. This being so, our puzzle asks after the meaning indicated by the expression e pluribus unum. Is the Republic one? Because we are not dealing with intentions or conceptions, our investigation is not directly helped by knowing where the phrase came from. Evidently Cicero by way of Benjamin Franklin, or who says it, the Department of the Treasury for one, only that it is said of our putative republic. It is for this reason that our puzzle is philosophical and not historical. That this is a philosophical puzzle, allow me briefly to demonstrate. Should the puzzle be answered yes, we would find ourselves confronted with the McCloskeys, the protesters, Kyle Rittenhouse, law enforcement agencies, and that situation that hot July afternoon at RJ's Bob BQ. These incidents do not themselves constitute the problem for the affirmative answer, they indicate it. If the Republic is one, then in what does its unity consist? Not place, not time, not custom, not opinion. It's not that just that America is fragmented, it's that it always has been. This is what Robin Wright is getting to when she asks, is America a myth? Her discussion introduces the relevant matters for consideration, but the question, casually posed as it is imprecise and potentially perilously so. Myths have always served a persuasive function. Whether or not America is a myth, does it persuade us of anything real? The claim that it does must face the facts. Let's try the negative. Again, we're confronted with hip holsters, marches, and the McCloskeys. If it is not the case that the Republic is one, then what are these people fighting about? That is, how does it come about that the very agents of its fragmentation claim to be acting on behalf of the one thing? That this claim is common is remarkable, especially more so is its regularity. Not only does each of the people involved in these events appear to believe he's acting on behalf of the Republic, each person expresses this belief in the same terms: rights, the Constitution, freedom, and most evidently, that the other side is trying to destroy us. Above all, though, the greatest consideration to be brought to bear against the negative is that these parties commonly and regularly participate in common institutions, elections, taxation, the courts, and so on. That there is nothing to see here is a claim that likewise must face the facts. Thus, the philosophical puzzle of whether the Republic is won. I turn now to the history of philosophy in order to clarify our situation relative to it. It is indeed striking that so little is commonly made of the fact that the United States is a republic convened according to a philosophy. This is usually mentioned only in passing as an anodyne article of patriotic confession. Even if the philosophical foundations of our country are merely apparent, the ramifications of this for the history and development of the whole human condition are remarkable. American thinkers, including Franklin, Jefferson, and Madison, were deeply influenced not only by classical political philosophy, but also by modern European and especially modern English and Scottish philosophical discourse. Of the latter two categories, doubtless the primary shapers of early American political perspectives are Montesquieu, Rousseau, and perhaps chiefly John Locke. Locke and Rousseau were early advocates of contractarianism. The essential feature of this political theory is the claim that legitimate authority in a society can arise only by virtue of the unanimous consent of the members to yield some degree, perhaps all, of their natural endowments, rights, freedoms, property, and so forth up to the community. It is a worthwhile exercise to examine the framing documents of early American politics for the fingerprints of contractarian thinking. The preamble to the Constitution serves as a particularly conspicuous example. More notable here for present purposes is the fact that contractarians of any era have consistently seen fit to address the question of why someone would willingly give up to the society what is otherwise hers alone. A variety of answers have been given: survival, justice, freedom, the preservation of property, to name a few, all of which imply that a republic would not be convened but for some end its members have in view. To this common feature of the contractarian mindset we will return. Most pressing at this point is the question that arises for contractarians concerning permanent popular sovereignty. The idea that not only does sovereignty, that is, supreme rightful authority, originate with the people, but that the people never divest themselves of this sovereignty. This interpretation of the people's thing does not originate with Locke or even Montesquieu, but can be found as far back as the works of Jean Bodin. Whether or not any of the framers of the Constitution in fact accepted such a view, it would be difficult indeed to overstate the influence this proposition continues to exercise over the American mind. Ever since the winning of our independence, U.S. history has been punctuated by the animation and reanimation of debate about the limits of popular sovereignty. From the Whiskey Rebellion to the Civil War to jury nullification to bumper stickers declaring, "Not my president," the specter of the reversion of power from the law of the land into the hands of the people has haunted our putative social contract. At least one prominent modern philosopher argues that such volatility is hardly an accidental circumstance, but is rather a necessary consequence of the contractarian point of view. In his work on political philosophy, the 19th century German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel contends that as long as the republic is conceived as a contract, its very existence can be only incompletely realized. A contract exists just as long as the individuals party to it agree. Any republic so devised is nothing more than an abstraction subject to the whims of its constituents. Hegel cites actual history here in order to illustrate the catastrophic consequence of such a misconception. The French Revolution ended in terror because no one involved had any reason to honor the Republic because the Republic wasn't really there. Nothing about it transcended the immediate opinions of its members, and so its being was merely ephemeral. A republic is a true unity if and only if its concept exists, notwithstanding the contingent conceptions of its several members. It is this Hegelian objection to which the globalist Thomas Friedman seems woefully deaf in suggesting that the one of the Great Seal be replaced with we. 19th century philosophy aside, Friedman's own rhetoric undermines his thesis. If we are only a mixture and nothing truly substantial, then what is this America, singular, of which he continues to speak? But if not the contract to which its members stipulate, in what might the unity of the Republic consist? An answer to this is indeed suggested by the modern political philosophers themselves, but in order to appreciate its full force, we must venture yet further back in time. Recall, if you will, that a moment ago I noted that contractarian thinkers of all stripes find it necessary to say why someone would involve herself in a republic, given that this is done only on the condition that natural liberties be given up. I wish to focus here not on the variety of specific responses to this question, but rather on the universality of both the perceived need for a response and the nature to which any legitimate response must conform. For every political philosopher of whom I've thus far spoken, contractarian or otherwise, the why of the Republic can be meaningfully framed only in terms of what good the Republic is to its members. That is, what the Republic is for. Long ago, the ancients strove for definition, not of their words, but of the world. What, they asked, constitutes the essence of a thing? Something's definition, if it could be determined, would establish the conditions for its unity and therefore the possibility of its existence. It was Aristotle who first explicated this task in detail. In his great work on metaphysics, he exhausts a number of possible leads. Perhaps something's definition is to be found in the matter out of which it emerges. No, definition must be constant, but it is the nature of matter to undergo change. Could the definition be located in a thing's intrinsic structure? This seems a more promising hypothesis, but it appears to be undermined by the fact that things do not always display their ideal structure, especially in the nascent stages of their development. At last, Aristotle, following and improving upon the track laid down by his philosophical forebears, comes to identify something's definition with its end, the sake for which it exists and acts. Foremost pioneer of the biological sciences, Aristotle's model for understanding the relationship between definitions and ends is the organism, the living being. Not every hatchling will survive to become an adult sea turtle, but the complete state of adulthood is the unmoving target that guides the life and growth of the animal. Human beings, Aristotle thought, exemplify a special mode of creative definition. In those activities known as the arts, objects are manipulated and formed according to a plan, a design established at the outset that serves as the unmoving blueprint guiding the work. As the adult state of the organism is to its infancy, so is the craftsman's design to the raw materials. So it is, Aristotle thinks, that we are afforded a special insight into the dynamics of teleology, according to which the end activates the movement of the means. Glossed over in Aristotle's treatment, however, is the fact that the outworking of this plan is often noisy, messy, and tiresome. Anyone who has ever undertaken a home improvement project of sufficient scope will testify to the passing of days when the final product seems to be nothing more than a distant and receding wish. All you wanted was a refurbished bathroom, but it turns out that the angles were never square and the surfaces never level to begin with. Remedial carpentry is necessary, and the conflict of your ultimate aims with the circumstances in which you find yourself cannot help but count as a loss. But setting feelings aside, your rational thinking recognizes that the struggle must be borne with if the aim is ever to be achieved. Amateur economists will balk at any suggestion of throwing good resources after bad, but this presumes a concrete notion of the goodness of what we have in spite of what there may be. In other words, it ignores what King called the arc of the moral universe. Ratiocination is not a precondition for growth. Wildflowers bloom on the roadside, plan or no. Still, we must acknowledge a distinction between the natural serendipity of scattered seeds bursting forth and the carefully plotted growth of a bright garden. This is the difference between growth and culture. Intention is not a necessary condition for the former, but the latter can be realized only once the end has been brought to mind. This done, thought will not rest until the movements of the parts have been reconciled to the plan of the whole. You may never get around to those weeds in the garden, but they'll bother you every time you look at them. We've already spoken of myths and their persuasive function. Aristotle's teacher, Plato, unquestionably a philosopher of the first order, was nevertheless known to employ mythology on occasion in order to drive a point home. He once spoke of the human condition as a chariot pulled by two horses, one good, the other bad. Of course, it fell to the driver to get to move them in concert. This is a story about ends. Desires, both noble and ignoble, pull a person this way and that, and unless she regulates them by way of rational thinking and planning, she risks pulling herself apart. The same is true of human society. Whether it originates, that is, from rational decisions or from social instinct, is essentially irrelevant to the question of how it ought to be regulated. The gardener is engaged in a struggle with the plants, the weather, herself. She, like the flowers and fruits, labors to bring forth one out of many. She is able to envision the end, but she cannot know it until it comes about. The larger the plot, the more lavish and complex the garden, the longer the growing season, the more the actual end is hidden from view. The difference between the struggle of a single daffodil and the growing season of life in a broad mountain range is analogous to the difference between a boxing match and a war. Indeed, he might have been gardening when President Eisenhower philosophized that in war, he found plans to be useless, but planning to be indispensable. Hegel calls America the land of the future. Lecturing in Berlin in the 1820s, he spoke of a country in the early stages of its growth. Lewis and Clark's expedition was not 15 years old. Not a decade prior, English aggression had been successfully resisted only just for the second time. 200 years later, our future is still in front of us, and we can hardly stand it. We want to peek at the last page of the book. We want to know if we win, but all we see in front of us is conflict and struggle. There is no such thing as metaphysical prophecy. The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at dusk. But philosophy's elucidation of the nature of the concepts amidst which we find ourselves can at least afford us the reassurance that finality is not heat death. There is literally no reason for nihilism. Can there be one out of many? There can be. There will be. There must be. What we still have to see for ourselves is what this one will be. Our republic is no thing of the past, and that is why we can never yet see it clearly. Here the philosopher must fall silent. For as Hegel reminds us, in regard to philosophy, our concern is neither with what was, nor with what is yet to be, but with what is, as eternal reason. And that's enough to keep us occupied. Thank you. I'm receiving some questions now.
Yes, excellent address. And I have forwarded 2 questions that have arrived so far. That is outstanding. So I'll let you address that. The first question that came in: what are some of the common tactics that the far left and the far right use against each other to create division?
Boy, that is an excellent question. I would be stepping outside of my expertise, which consists only in philosophy, to speak of political tactics. I can begin to gesture at the distinction between direct action and political action. It seems to me, reacting only as a consumer of the news and not speaking from any expert standpoint here, that the far wings of the left and the right favor direct action, and we are seeing an increasing favoring over the last half decade or so, it seems, in favor of what's known as violent direct action in order to accomplish ends by way of circumventing the political process. That is all the farther onto this limb that I want to wade out because, again, I possess no special knowledge of that. So I'm sorry I can't be more help. It's an excellent question.
Yes, it is. And we'll be seeing more from the far left and the far right, I think, in the weeks to come. Second question: with the growing separation between the two parties, will this allow a potential moderate third party to grow? Or do you see the two-party system somehow fixing itself?
Boy, again, that proviso about metaphysical prophecy at the end of the paper was meant in full bore, and so I'm sorry to have to disappoint again. It's certainly possible. The garden motif is the one that I retreat to, as I'm sure that people have heard. And so is there a space on the ground cleared for a third party, for some sort of a moderate party? Those of you who follow the chattering class as closely as I do, which is to say moderately so, see that there's some rumblings about this, but I'm old enough to know that has happened before, that seems to be, thus far in my experience of America, a cyclical thing. Time will tell. And again, I have no special secret knowledge on questions like these. I apologize for disappointing. It's another good one.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting issues here. Another question that has just popped in: what forces or interests will conspire to determine or discern the purpose or shape of our republic?
So this is one that the history of philosophy actually has a little bit to say about. Again, only reflecting the puzzling nature of the question. For a long time, it was supposed that the sorts of, so if we dig far enough back in the history of what's broadly construed as the West, by which we would mean Europe and Western Asia and Northern Africa, for that matter, for a long time, it was thought that what conspired to determine the purpose or the shape of our republic was what's known as divine providence. This is the idea that the hand of God determines things from without, so to speak, eternally, that there is what Thomas Aquinas refers to as an eternal law that is determined on earth according to the natural law and also the moral law. And it is by following these things, this was the perspective of a lot of certainly Catholic medieval philosophy, by following the divine and moral law, people could better approximate to the image of God, which eventually would bring about the beatific vision and the renewal of the world. Now, needless to say, in modern times, this idea gets turned on its head. And so people begin with the sort of Cartesian and early Enlightenment focus on the mechanical philosophy to start to believe, to start to dispose of this reference to ends, this reference to final causes, the sake for which things exist and act, and attempt to explain even the movements of history by virtue of mechanism, by virtue of the interaction of forces and treating people as social atoms, if you will. That began to be faced with serious objections in the early 19th century. And so what we have is a competing variety of philosophical answers to that question, all the way from one end of the spectrum. And now in the Enlightenment, folks thought that human reason would determine the fate of history. These days, we have political philosophical perspectives that range from the idea that the most common and brute form of human desires ultimately interacting with the environment with which we're surrounded. So that's sort of a deflationary answer, all the way to people rebooting this idea of final causes, the sake for which the Republic exists and acts. You can tell from my remarks where it is I fall along that spectrum, but that's more than you ever wanted to know as a canvas to the history of the answers to that excellent question.
Indeed, that's a great question. Another one just came in, and I was thinking along this line as well. Can you give more insight on keeping a philosophical perspective in politics?
I can try. One of the perils away from which philosophy has tried to steer us for 2,500 years is that of unearned certainty, certainty in the absence of knowledge, unweaned confidence. Dedication to an ideology can be qualified usefully, I think, as adherence to a theoretical template that is supposed to determine future practical consequences, meaning you subscribe to a few beliefs and it tells you what to do and what's going to happen. I think philosophy properly understood is a useful antidote to this. It encourages a certain intellectual moderation and humility such that things always have a way of coming back around to their opposite. That doesn't mean that we're operating in a vicious circle, but rather perhaps a virtuous one. We come back to our initial standpoint, but this time better armed through experience and rational consideration, not only with theoretical techniques for understanding the world around us, but practical techniques for engaging in those whom we do not yet understand. And so if there are two things that philosophy can offer us in our approach to politics, the watchwords there would be humility and moderation, I think.
Thank you. Someone has name-checked Plato in framing his question. Plato believed that human minds inherently resist the change in their conception of reality. How does that correlate with the public today?
So the mind does and it doesn't. One of the things that we want to remember about Plato's ontology of, or well, Plato's rational psychology is what we would call it now, is that Plato has this idea that the soul is divided. One part of the soul, that is the mind, which was correctly name-checked in the question, is unmoved. Or better, the mind in its best state is unmoved. But we have to remember that we engage politically in the atmosphere of the practical universe. We engage with our bodies, we engage with our desires, we engage with these other aspects of what Plato thought of as the soul that are not inherently intellectual. One of which is what in the Greek is called thumos and is often translated as spirit or will. It's this idea of the sort of thing that drives one's competitive instinct, also driving one's sense of self-righteousness. It was the kind of thing that the Greeks thought animated somebody in battle. We have to recognize, I think if we're operating within the framework of Plato, we have to recognize that that's always operative in the political sphere. And so one of the ways that the chariot myth is supposed to help us to understand how it is that the parts of the soul are to be organized is that we can't deny the existence of our basic desires and also this idea of a spirited will. It's just that they have to be governed by reason. And so reflection on reality, and Plato, and shameless plug here, thought that this could only be accomplished by philosophical study. Focus on the unchanging aspects of reality is what the intellect can use to keep the chariot steered in a single and proper direction. And so even though the intellect doesn't change in its best states, part of the work of the entire soul is realizing that the rest of it does. Plato did not think that virtue was cultivated simply by the hegemony of the intellect over the other parts of the soul, but rather the harmony of all three parts. And so since we know that in the political sphere, to speak a little bit more plainly, we know that in the political sphere, we are activated by emotions and we are activated by desires. The key is not to deny this in some pseudo-stoicism. The key is to acknowledge it and to discipline it through an educated mind. I think that would be the Platonic position of the question.
Thank you, Chaz. Can you identify some practical techniques for engaging with those whom we do not understand?
Again, I can do what philosophy can do here. One of the things that we notice and I'll use as a case in point some of the early Platonic dialogues, since Plato was already brought up. One of the things that we notice goes on in the works of Plato is that conversations are being held, and these conversations are contentious at times, and they're back and forth. But one of the recurring motifs that you find in Plato is at the beginning of the dialogues, the participants in the conversation explicitly settle the question of how they're going to do business. The Greeks, in that environment of ancient classical democracy that we all learned about in the 7th grade, if not before, had an opportunity to speak to one another and to attempt to persuade them of their points of view. But they understood that not all means of persuasion were the same. And so one of the motifs, for instance, that we see is that the participants in a Platonic dialogue will ask each other whether they want to operate on friendly terms or not. Operating in the form of the question and answer, the back and forth dialogue that was known to the ancients as dialectic, is an effective technique of achieving some sort of persuasive agreement, but only if the parties involved will do so on friendly terms. If they will not, it is most efficient that this be acknowledged in advance. And then the technique is what the ancients called oratory. And so what people would do is instead give long speeches. We can see this exemplified in presidential debates. If you think about, just imagine how useless it would be to have Biden and Trump ask each other back and forth questions. Each of them would only be trying to get the better of the other. And so it's much more efficient for our purposes, because we know that they are so opposed. They are speaking, as it were, on unfriendly terms. It's best just to let each man give a speech and be quiet while the other one does the same. But if you are speaking to someone with whom you have cultivated a prior friendly relationship, try the format of question and answer. Decide in advance whether you will be the one who will allow herself to be put to the question, or whether your interlocutor will be the one who allows himself to be put to the question, and then operate accordingly. That's one suggestion.
Thank you. Chaz, I'm wondering what philosophers say about the future of democracy itself. I mean, obviously, as a philosophical construct, it can last forever as long as we discuss it and write about it. But as a practical form of governance, I wonder what the future of democracy is, and I wonder what you and your colleagues in your discipline are saying, because your comments regarding contract spoke very decidedly to me, because let's face it, we're seeing a president openly opining about breaking the law, such as having a third term, or hinting that voters should try to vote twice, or thinking that the Hatch Act is no longer relevant. So we're seeing some challenges to the contract, some serious challenges, and reactions to it politically seem to run along party lines. But I'm wondering what philosophy might have to say.
So two names I'll cite here. Thank you, Michael, for that question. Two names I'll cite here. One is a philosopher, a perfectly competent philosopher, who sadly, over the course of the past 10 years or so, has had to have his tail between his legs month by month. And that is a man named Francis Fukuyama. As many in the audience will recognize the name, Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous essay in the 1990s entitled The End of History, in which he hypothesized, he argued along the lines of the philosopher Hegel, who I already mentioned in my talks, that we had reached the end of history, that liberal democracy wins, and that now it was just a matter of liberal democracy spreading to every corner of the globe. Well, the past decade or two have manifestly called this into question. I'll go back to the motif of gardening that I introduced in the talk. What we have in the case of democracy is a rule by the people, and so if you like, that's a community garden. That's all of us getting together and gardening all at once. When we say that the community, as the United States of America, was convened according to a social contract, that's to say that when we started the community garden, we had a plan. It's entirely possible that over the course of the long ages of its growth and the circumstances that it has endured, we as community gardeners can become wise to the idea that the initial plan was incomplete. The initial plan was abstract. It couldn't possibly have taken everything into account. And so as sagacious gardeners, as gardeners displaying what Aristotle would have called phronesis, practical wisdom, we need to be on the lookout for changes in the weather, so to speak, and react as a community to those changes in the weather. As Michael points out, the idea of democracy as an abstract concept can subsist indefinitely. Can it exist on the face of the world? That's a question, just like gardening, of our interaction with the natural forces and including social forces amidst which we find ourselves. I'll bring back in the remark that I quoted from Eisenhower. Plans may be useless, but planning is indispensable. We have to acknowledge the mutual participation of everyone else in this community garden and agree to plan in such a way that we remind ourselves continually of the need for intellectual agility, flexibility, and humility. We have to acknowledge the possibility that the initial plan is outmoded, that it has been superseded by considerations that it could not possibly have anticipated. But at the root, we have to have a commitment to what the philosopher John Rawls describes as a sense of justice. At bottom, we are all human beings, and armed with respect for our intrinsic personhood, we are then equipped with a mutual history that allows us to come together and think about altering the plans as gardeners who are mutually interested and wondered at the final product.
Well said. I like that very much. Let me see if we have any more questions. I don't think any more questions have been popping in the chat box. I want to thank you for today's presentation, and I want to thank the audience for coming in with some really outstanding questions. I was very glad that you made this an up to the minute, or at least up to the summer presentation, because the incident in the Central West End with the lawyer couple, I wasn't at that demonstration, but I know personally at least 15 or 20 people who were. And so knowing people who had guns pointed at them really made it hit home. And I'm very glad that there was no gunfire that night, because we know what can happen. So there are such practical, immediate, and life consequential dimensions of what you've just discussed. Yeah, I'm seeing some thanks come in, but I think that's all the questions that we have. What's your latest reading in philosophy? When you read for pleasure and you pick up philosophy, what's the latest thing that you picked up, Chaz?
Well, I geek out about this stuff, Michael. I think it's the coolest and most important stuff in the world. And so I'm a total nerd. I do read philosophy for fun. Lately, I've been going through a series of Harvard lectures delivered in the early 1900s by the greatest of all American philosophers, a gentleman by the name of Charles Sanders Peirce, whose foremost political connection is that he met Theodore Roosevelt on a number of occasions when Roosevelt was a young man, and Peirce was one of the first to say, "This guy's going somewhere." So I've been reading Peirce's Harvard lectures and having a chance, even in the midst of this woeful pandemic, to correspond at a distance with an old friend of mine who was a partner of mine in crime in graduate school, and he is now teaching out in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We've been going through Peirce's lectures. I won't boast with a fine-tooth comb, but perhaps with a broad brush, and enjoying the intellectual refreshment that sort of thing provides. That's what I've been up to lately.
That's great. And if there's one, especially short reading, that you would recommend to anyone who attended who wants to inquire further, what should be on the reading list? Well,
I'm going to take that ball and illicitly run with it. You asked for one. I'll give you a little bit more than one. Sure. I mentioned John Locke and the Second Treatise of Government. I know many in my audience have read that and been through it maybe more than once. If you have not, it's important to read the Second Treatise, because it is the raw material from which the framers, by whom I'm referring to Franklin, Jefferson, and Madison principally, they would have had Locke on the back burner of their minds. If Locke is old hat to you, I would encourage dipping your toes. One of the things that and so I have some of this on my mind because some of it I'm having students in my ethics class read. One of the things that's a more up-to-date version of contractarian philosophy is John Rawls's 1971 masterwork, A Theory of Justice. The best that can be said of A Theory of Justice was said by one of Rawls's opponents, a man named Robert Nozick, who said that of the theory of justice, he said, from now on, everyone must work within Rawls's theory or say why not. So the 1971 work, A Theory of Justice, deceptively straightforwardly written, systematic, and comprehensive. And then if you're looking for something from across the pond and a little bit deeper into the forests of Germany, I would encourage picking up Hegel, and perhaps the best politically relevant document of Hegel's with which to begin would be his Introduction to the Philosophy of History. Again, if you're interested in reading these in a guided format, I would encourage you to consider Philosophy 160, Ethics, in which we take a walk down those rabbit trails and on into the deep woods.
That's great. Thank you. There was one other comment about the future of democracy. What would you say about the future?
I'm as interested to know the answer to that question as anyone else. As I say, I have no crystal ball. I have no particular kind of metaphysical insight. I will say, again, to emphasize the sense in which philosophy can cultivate a certain intellectual humility about these things. Be careful of the sense that we are just about at the end of the road. We want things to be settled because we want to have to stop the labor of thinking about things. We go to Hegel one more time. One of the ways that Hegel describes the philosophical enterprise is as a highway of despair. Imagine traveling on the interstate and thinking that every exit ramp is the last one that you need to get to, but as soon as you pull off on the exit ramp, it just dumps you back out on the highway. Philosophy tends to do that. And so when we think about democracy, I would encourage the moderation of one's own approach to the subject matter in the following way. Consider the search itself to be kind of an end. I know that sounds like a cliche, but guard against the misery that can arise from the discovery that democracy is not the end of the road. Democracy is a piece of a larger puzzle. That's all I can say because, again, the philosopher has to fall silent in discussions about the future.
Very well said. Thank you for that. I think that's some wise words. And I think that concludes the questions. I want to thank you. This has been outstanding. It's been really thought-provoking. And I think we've all been given some things to ponder. So I thank you, Chaz.
Thank you, Michael. It's an honor and a privilege to present at Democracy Days. It always is. I do not deserve the audiences that we receive, and I want to thank the audience for excellent questions. I apologize for my frailty and my inadequacy as an answerer and as a presenter. Keep undertaking the search, despite the shortcomings of the person who's presented the paper here today. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, SCC.
Thanks again, and I'm going to remember that about the need for intellectual humility and the nature of the ongoing dimension of this whole thing that we call democracy. All right, that will conclude this session. Thank you again, Chaz, and stay with us for more Democracy Days at 1 o'clock today, and then 3 more sessions Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Thanks, everybody.